The presentation is done in Creole, and a short summary of the presentation is done in English.
Pa bliye, kou Kreyòl ayisyen nan Duke, l'ouvri pou tout étudiant nan University of Virginia, Vanderbilt University ak University of North Carolina Chapel-Hill, ki ma konen fos yo ansam pou fè kombit Kreyòl la avanse.
Don't forget the Haitian Creole course at Duke is open for every student at the University of Virginia, Vanderbilt University, and the University of North Carolina Chapel-Hill, and they culminate their strengths together to advance the Creole collective.
Apre prezentasyon etudyan, nou toujou invite yon chècheur ki travay sur yon phénomène lengwistik nan yon nan Kreyòl ki eksiste yo, ou swa sou yon aspect ki gen pou wè ak la vi yon peyi kote nou jwenn yon lang Kreyòl.
After the student or students' presentations, we always invite a researcher who works on linguistic phenomena in one of the varieties of Creole that exists, or works on an aspect that's related to the life of a country where we find a Creole language.
Pou fini, map di gen 12 étudiants ak 8 chercheurs ki deja prezante nan kombit sa soti 2013, rive jounen jodi ya. Juste yon ti detay pou kek moun sa interese. 3 nan 8 chercheurs yo, se moun natif natal Haïti, 2 lot yo se moun Saint-Lucie, yon lot se moun Jamaïque, yon se moun Afrique du Sud, et jodi ya se yon moun nan zile Moris nou gen avek nou.
As a final note, I'd like to add that 12 students and 8 researchers have presented in this collective since 2013, right up until today. Just some small details for those people who are interested. 3 of the 8 researchers were native Haitians, 2 others were St. Lucians, another from Jamaica, 1 person from South Africa, and today we have with us a researcher from Mauritius Island.
Merci pour patience.
Thank you for your patience.
Ok, bonsoir tout le monde. Est-ce que vous entendez? Oui. Moi, je suis Isabel. Je étudié créole haïtien dans Duke. L'année passée, je me suis présentée dans jounen. Je fait un doctorat dans le département Environment Studies. J'ai étudié écologie et littérature caribéenne. Dans la classe créole semestre avec Jacques, professeur Pierre, nous avons travaillé sur 2-3 chanteurs traditionnels haïtiens. Et je suis un pile dans chanter ça yo. Aujourd'hui, je suis content un pile partager yon dans chanter ça yo avec vous. Les petits oiseaux. Good evening, everyone. My name is Isabel. I'm studying Creole at Duke. Last year, I presented at Kreyòl. I'm doing my doctorate in Romance Studies. I study Caribbean ecologies and literatures. In Creole class this semester, we have been working on several traditional Haitian songs. I really love them, and today I'll share one of them with you. It's called Petits oiseaux, a little bird. Merci. Konya, c'est un plaisir pour me présenter Chloé Heimer. Année passée, l'homme t'est présenté dans la journée créole là, c'est lui-même qui t'est présenté. Chloé, c'est un étudiant doctoral dans UNC, dans le département littérature comparative. Il étudie littérature caraïbe francophone là avec études mémoire. La écrit thèse li sous travail avec mouvement politique, avec rapport yo gain avec style littéraire dans roman haïtien. Jodia li pral parler sous importance resous qui en créole pour recherche dissertation li. Moi remercie tout le monde qui est là pour tendre. Tonight it's my pleasure to introduce Chloe Heimer. Last year, when I presented at Kreyòl Day, she was the one who introduced me. Chloe is a PhD student in comparative literature at UNC. She studies Francophone Caribbean literature and memory studies. Her dissertation will focus on the relationship between labor, anti-capitalist activism, and literary form. Today, she'll speak about the importance of Creole language resources for her dissertation research. Thank you.
Bien, Isabelle. M'a partagé une petite présentation avec nous. Est-ce que tout le monde entendait moi?
Oui.
Ok, bien,
Oui.
merci. Ok. Partager. Ok. Petite présentation moi, c'est importance ressources qui est en créole pour des citations moi. Ok. Moi, relais, Chloé. Moi, espérer tout le monde bien. Merci pour venir ici. Moi, je voulais dire professeur Pierre et un gros merci parce que il organisait journée ça. Et puis, pour tout ça, l'a fait pour aider les étudiants avec d'autres mêmes communautés créoles. Il s'est partagé connaissances avec sagesse liée avec moi plusieurs fois. Faut que je me remercie avant de commencer. Et puis, professeur Henri m'a essayé parler en créole Moris, mais Mauricien, mais merci pour venir ici. Moi, contente qui m'a pour ton discours. Moi, relais Chloé, je suis un étudiant diplômé dans le département anglais avec littérature comparative dans UNC. Isabel t'a dit. Recherche moins à focaliser sur littérature haïtienne contemporaine et puis spécialement sur rapport en style écrit avec description plusieurs formes de travail dans le roman. Ma petite créole n'a donc avec professeur Pierre depuis 2 années. Ma travail toujours pour créer le moins 20 puis bon, mais tant pis, excusez-moi si mon fait erreur. Beaucoup jamais eu chance pour aller en Haïti pour me pratiquer tout bon vrai, mais moi t'aimerais aller un jour. Aujourd'hui, on m'a parlé sur relations qui existaient entre éducation, langue et système de connaissances coloniales. Et puis, qui genre, moi, aborder relations, ça n'en recherche moins. Mais avant, on voulait dire 2-3 bagailles sur éducation moins, c'est recevoir dans la classe créole, parce que l'éducation, ça a été influencé travail moins fondamentalement. Yon bagay pi important mwen te apprendre dans classe créole yo, c'est différence entre apprendre dans yon langue et apprendre yon langue. Dans yon interview entre professeur Yves Desjans et professeur Pierre qui paraît dans le Journal of Haitian Studies dans 2020, professeur Desjans parlait sur qui genre est important pour yon système d'éducation comprendre apprendre dans yon langue et apprendre yon langue. Et ça nous fait bien dans Duke à UNC. Nous apprenons en anglais et puis quelqu'un nous décide d'apprendre créole. So, brief summary in English. Hello everyone, my name is Chloe Himmer. Like Isabel said, I am a PhD student in the Department of English and Comp Lit at UNC Chapel-Hill. I've been studying Haitian Creole for 2 years with Professor Pierre. Today I will be discussing the relationship between education, language, and colonial systems of knowledge, and particularly how I approach these topics in my own research as a result of how I've been studying Creole with Duke's program. One of the most important lessons I've learned in my time studying Creole is the difference between learning a language and learning something in a language. And this is a distinction that's emphasized by Creolist Professor Yves Desjans. Et mais une petite citation, professeur Pierre posait question à qui ça yon langue yé? Et professeur Desjans répond, c'est un système qui permet de réfléchir, calculer, poser tête aux questions, jouer une réponse, et puis qui permet de parler l'autre monde ça qui n'en tête yo. Ça yo connaît, reconnaître ça l'autre monde pensé, ça yo connaît, ça yo voulait. Moi même bien citation ça là, ça. Dans classe créole yo, moi tu apprends information sur l'autre côté tout partout dans le monde là. Côté yo parler langue créole, tronco Haïti, oui, Martinique, Guadeloupe, Seychelles, Réunion avec Moris. Et dans classe ça, c'était première fois moi tu ouais pays ça yo dans même groupe. C'est parce que système éducation américain enseigne nous Haïti c'est un pays francophone. Si un étudiant veut étudier littérature haïtienne, c'est pour lui étudier langue et culture français en vain. Presque toute information sur le pays post-colonial dans le système d'éducation occidental centré sur le pays colonisateur. Ces systèmes qui valorisaient connaissances révolution française sans étudiants américains pas jamais entendu non tout sans le petit à la way pour Dessalines. Pour qui ça m'a dit, ça nous tout connaît, c'est parce que mettez un pays ou bien un sujet étude dans une catégorie car un outil colonial ou bien un outil pour guérir violence coloniale. C'est ça Richard Charles écrit dans le préface livre Paulo Freire, Pedagogy of the Oppressed. There is no such thing as a neutral educational process. Il pas exister un processus d'éducation qui est net, neutral. C'est comme ça nous besoin continuer à célébrer la langue créole. Cette langue surtout dans un contexte académique qui historiquement valorisé langue et épistémologie européenne et états-unienne, c'est une action politiquement puissante. Les moyens de commencer à apprendre plus sur ces langues en Haïti, moi, de plus en plus, qui genre langue majorité woman haïtien, c'est pas langue majorité peuple haïtien. Et m'a discuté problème ça plus dans un petit moment. Pourtant, ça moyen d'apprendre en classe créole, c'est important l'autre forme d'expression artistique et culturelle. Par exemple, nous apprendre plusieurs proverbes dans Kuyo. Par exemple, chita pabay, la caille c'est la caille, parler français pas veut dire l'esprit. Il a trié. Et créole parler, créole comprendre, c'était non chanter, on t'entendait. Proverbe sayo, pas seulement qui phrase pleine sagesse, c'est en façon de parler sur problèmes sociaux et politiques sans besoin d'y trop. Nous avons étudié plusieurs formes de musique dans le créole tout. Tant qu'on compare zouk avec musique racine. Et pour montrer vite qui genre musique avec proverbe gain gros pouvoir politique et social en Haïti, on regarde un petit exemple célèbre. Dans l'année 1990, un groupe musique racine qui relaie beaucoup mon expérience, a chanté Qu'aime pas sauter dans le carnaval pour critiquer le gouvernement militaire Prosper Avril là. Chanter ça a précipité un mouvement populaire qui chavirait le régime là. Pourtant, d'après Gage Avril, c'est un ethnomusicologue, Avril pas trop fin comprendre si chanter a c'est visé équipe li vrai. Avril expliquez-nous, quote, he didn't know what to make of it. He didn't understand it, and his advisors didn't understand it. Some thought it might even be pro-government. But that's what happens in wrestling music. There's room for interpretation. A lot of songs are based on songs sung at voodoo temples and are themselves based on African music and proverbs. If you don't know the code, it doesn't mean much. Ça veut dire, même Prosper Avril, pas de connaître ça, chanter ça, veut dire, mais avec musique racine là, gain espace pour interpréter chanter. Ça veut dire, c'est un shampoing, ou bien une forme marronnage, ou bien ça avéré le relais en anglais indirect signification. Même façon avérée définit thème marronnage là, dans le sens contemporain. L'idée, c'est, quote, a rubric for a class of tactics of resistance and subterfuge, suggesting a reinterpretation of the term over the course of history of resistance to agents of oppression, whether foreign or national, against whom outright warfare was impossible. Proverbe fonctionne dans la même façon. Pour yon moun, yon proverbe ou bien yon chanté, gagne un sens superficiel ou bien général. Pour yon l'autre, il gagne un sens plus spécifique. C'est une forme de vision politique ou bien sociale qui a évité plus faux danger. Et, vite en anglais, by celebrating International Kreyòl Day, I want to say that we're engaging in a political act, and we're celebrating a group of languages that has been historically undervalued and understudied in academia. While Haitian novels are often written in French, in Kreyòl class we learned of the importance of proverbs and music in Haitian culture. And I am also discussing this idea of literary marronnage that's developed in part by ethnomusicologist Gage Averill, who discusses in particular the roots band Boukman Experience as a particularly influential group in encouraging popular protests that resulted in the removal of Prosper Averill's government. Dans classe Kreyòl, nous avons lu quelques poèmes Félix Morisot-Loa. Et lis ici. C'était un premier écrivain haïtien qui était gourmand ouvertement pour Kreyòl une langue respectée dans le domaine littéraire. M'a parlé sous l'Ikounia parce que c'est un plaisir aux haïtiens qui utilisait stratégie rhétorique qui liait avec marronnage littéraire. Pour Morisot-Loa, la vie politique avec la vie littéraire n'est pas différente. Angade, ça un écrivain haïtien qui relève Rodney Saint-Alora dit sous sujet Morisot-Loa. Écrire en créole pour lui est un manifeste politique afin que tous les Haïtiens participent de l'avenir de leur pays. Ça veut dire, écrire en créole pour Morisot-Loa, c'est un manifeste politique pour tout Haïtien participer dans l'avenir pays. Travail Morisot-Loa intéressait mon pile, pas seulement parce que c'était un premier écrivain qui écrit en créole, mais c'est parce que poésie et pièce théâtre faut nous poser questions sur dynamique pouvoir entre écrivain, public et sujet texte là. Mais il y a un exemple dynamique compliqué ça dans un poème écrit qui relève Moris. Dans le poème, Morisot-Loa écrit dans voix un moun qui a parlé avec un touriste blanc qui voulait prendre une photo. Un des stratégies rhétoriques Morisot-Loa utilisées pour décrire qui genre institution touriste là exploiter mon pauvre dans le pays postcolonial tant qu'au Haïti. Dans le poème ça, Morisot-Loa utilisait ironie et répétition spécialement pour montrer agence moun opprimé tant qu'on arrêtait. Montrer agence moun pauvre et colonisé ou bien moun cap subi néocolonialisme dans le pays, important en pile parce que les déranger et puis déconstruire le rapport entre colonisateur et moun colonisé. Dans le cas poème ça, nous avons une relation néocoloniale entre touristes et narrateur. Colonisateur, ou soit néocolonisateur, infantiliser moun colonisé. Yo pas voulu accepter moun colonisé tant qu'à répondre à violence coloniale et violence payo. Ironie, c'est une violence rhétorique qui dérangeait le discours normal. En faisant analyse sur quelques poèmes, pour voir qui Jean Morisot-Loa utilisait stratégie rhétorique ça. Narraté a dit, Touriste, pas prendre portrait touriste, on trop laide, on trop sale, on trop maigre. Une répétition dans le premier lit. Narraté, répétez-moi touriste deux fois, ça qui mettait accent sur le rôle social touriste là. Là qui j'aime narraté mettait accent sur pauvreté lui-même, les l'a utilisé ironie. Mais c'est important de songer qui j'en les répété mot touriste dans tout poème là. Nous avons dans le premier livre ça c'est narraté qui décrit lui-même tant qu'on l'aide ça la meg. Moris a joué avec l'idée en pile touriste blanc sous peuple haïtien. L'a joué avec stéréotype. Pourtant, même Jean Lidi bagay sa yo, l'a utilisé yo pour refuser vin objet photo. Ça veut dire, la petite, non, on pas vle objet photo parce que on pas méritel, mais qu'ayant ton sarcastique. Ça que l'a fait vraiment, c'est refuser vin objet. Et continuer, pas prendre portrait blanc. Monsieur Eastman pas content, on trop laide, Koda va craser. Konya, Naretea c'est précisé, c'est un touriste blanc, ça qui joue tourisme blanc avec société raciste américaine qui gagne un stéréotype négatif sur haïtien. Le poème qui dit Koda va craser, a gagne deux sens. Ça qui montre qui genre industrie touriste sous Paul Magloire t'es exploité mon pauvre en Haïti. Dans le sens qui est plus évident, ça signifie caméra pral craser si touriste là prend portrait Naretea. Parce que Naretea dit l'île l'aide en pile. Pourtant, c'est un poème qui est sarcastique en pile. Ça veut dire, Naretea a montré qui genre les mépriser touriste là pour préjuger l'IO. Et puis, il y a un côté social qui retient dans l'île là. Touristes là, en Haïti, parce que le pays est belle. Parce qu'il y a une belle plage, belle monde et la tri. Qui donc, Otea souligne, fait la gain, une différence entre richesse naturelle pays et mise et monde qui pourrait être là. Et puis finalement, il y a une autre façon d'interpréter l'île là. Naretea a menacé craser caméra touriste là. C'est une menace qui montre que Jean Naretea, ce n'est pas un objet. C'est un monde qui a réagi contre la violence économique et culturelle. Ma petite Fana, décolonisation, c'est toujours un phénomène violent. Bagay y a été colonisé à Vinmoun pendant le même processus par qui les libérait lui-même. Moris a montré Naretea, ce n'est pas un bagay, même s'il paraît faible. To summarize in English briefly, so here I discuss Félix Moris his poem Tourist, in particular his use of irony as a form of what I'm calling literary marronnage. I'm not the only one, but c'est le terme. And Frantz Fanon's assertion that for the colonized subject, self-liberation is a humanizing process, which I think is what Moris is describing in this poem towards the end. Dans 1953, Moris a écrit une pièce théâtre célèbre qui relève Antigone ou bien Antigone en créole. D'après Moris c'est Antigone qui t'a montré les possibles écrits pièces tragiques en créole. Pourtant, c'est Kimoun qui décidait ces pièces tragiques qui sont plus importantes par ses proverbes chantés ou bien histoires orales. Dans témoin, m'a analysé question ça avec question similaire. Qui rôle littérature militaire joué dans un pays postcolonial tant que Haïti, si majorité moun qui rete dans le pays ça pas de chance pour les textes. Et puis pour woman qui écrit en créole, qui ça y fait pour mélanger pouvoir politique langue créole avec style littéraire y a utilisé. Qui gens ont créé forme marronnage littéraire qui fait nous questionner système colonial à colonisation langue en même temps texte accessible tout. C'est Jean Casimir qui écrit non publié 1804 sous sujet langue créole avec travail scientifique. Il écrit connaissance avec utilisation langue nationale avec publication livre dans langue sayo, encourager développement dans littérature qui augmente prestige langue sayo et inviter moun qui vivent en bas kodio depuis siècle pour mettre l'idée de yo qui rassi dans coffre l'estomac yo. Sayo est fort comme ça à chercher. C'est mener majorité moun dans pays à occuper place là société douée. Ça veut dire tout le monde doit parler pour tête yo. Même pour arriver là, faut que nous joignions façon d'ouvrir conversation yo pour plus moun ka participer. M'a exploré l'idée ça yo dans un contexte qui souligne relation entre forme littéraire et description plaisir forme travail, mais question m'a posée yo applicable puis généralement tout. Et puis même si m'a toujours réfléchi sur cette question ça yo, si un jour mon joindre réponse là, c'est un peu l'idée sur l'éducation décoloniale là qui développait dans le programme Kreyòl là, cap menm là. And to summarize briefly in English, finally, my dissertation, my research focuses on questions surrounding literary form and linguistic accessibility in relation to work, different forms of labor. But I think that this can be applied to various areas of study. And again, I'd like to show my appreciation to Professor Pierre and Duke's Kreyòl program, as well as other programs who emphasize decolonial modes of research. So as I reflect upon these questions that I'm asking in the context of my own research, I know that any answers I find will be thanks to what I've learned by studying Kreyòl language and culture. Et c'est tout. Merci un peu. Si vous avez une question, moi, t'as content répondre. Et oui, c'est tout. Merci.
Bien. Ok. Est-ce qu'il y a un monde qui a une question pour Chloé? Vous êtes capable de voir une question dans le chat là. Et Isabelle a fait le travail là. Si il y a une question, nous avons temps pour nous prendre une grande question. Une grande. Ou bien en anglais, ou bien en créole. Capable de traduire pour moi, Isabelle?
Moi, oui, j'ai un petit commentaire par rapport à nous, Félix, Moris et Leroy. Est-ce que Chloé, tu as qu'à parler sur autographe non OTA, s'il vous plaît? So I said there's a comment that Félix Moris Leroy, he spells his name in French and there's his name spelled in Creole. Maybe you could talk about that.
Question 1, c'est pour qui ça Félix Moris Leroy écrit en français?
C'est juste un petit commentaire qui dit ne pas doit changer
ok.
autographe là.
Ah oui, excusez-moi. Moi, c'est oui, non, quelques articles et la trier non li qui non autographe autographe créole F-E-L-I-K-S, mais si c'est non l'autre autographe avec X et la trier, si c'est comme ça, il écrit non li, s'il vous plaît, excusez-moi, c'est comme ça, il écrit non li. Merci, c'est un bon note. Merci.
Oh, it seems there are two spellings, the Creole one with the K and the French one with the X.
Mm-hmm.
Ok, on a l'autre question tout court. Si pas gain l'autre question, n'a pas rapide passer dans gros conférence là. Ou capable de dire ça moi dit Isabelle.
If there are no other questions, we can move on to the main lecture of tonight.
Ok, bon.
Attendez, il y a une question. C'est une question qui posait Eric. Il dit combien l'école change curriculum pour ajouter créole en toute classe là. So how do schools change their curriculums to add Creole in every class?
Question 1, c'est pour l'école en Haïti?
Moi, imaginez, oui.
Ah oui, ok, sorry. Moi pas attendez. Ah oui, ok. Moi pas spécialisation, moi c'est pas non domaine éducation. Ça veut dire moi c'est pas moi pas gagné une réponse vraiment qui j'en dit well thought out. Mais gain en pile, vous savez, qui pensait en pile sur question ça, c'est une bonne question. Et Yves Desjans, c'est Yon qui écrit un pile sur l'idée nous y a besoin apprendre en créole en Haïti parce que c'est dans la langue maternelle Timoun apprend dans l'école. C'est pas le cas toujours. C'est pas vrai toujours aux États-Unis, mais en général, si on moun parle anglais, yo apprend en anglais. Il dit même dans un pays côté yo pas gain langue qui assez populé, assez côté pas gain assez monde qui parle langue ça. Par exemple dans c'est Norvège par exemple ou bien en Vietnam yo apprennent en vietnamien même si pas gain assez monde qui parle vietnamien pas assez anglais ou soit français mais yo ka apprendre une langue après ou apprendre bagay dans langue maternelle yo. Est-ce que ça c'est une réponse suffisante? Réponse là c'est en pile. Faut que y ait en pile ressources, en pile matériel, en pile professeur qui parle créole et puis qui a enseigné en créole. C'est un gros changement. Mais d'après plusieurs CV moi et puis d'après moi pas expert, mais d'après moi, c'est un changement qui est nécessaire, même si ça prend un peu de temps.
Ok, bon, bien. Donc, on y est, nous allons passer dans la deuxième phase là. C'est un plaisir pour moi d'introduire professeur Fabiola Henri, qui est mon natif natal, Zile Moris.
It is a pleasure for me to introduce Professor Fabiola Henri, who is from Mauritius.
Il a un doctorat en linguistique, l'a enseigné dans l'University de Buffalo.
She holds a doctorate in linguistics. She teaches at the university at Buffalo.
Avant ça, elle était dans Kentucky University.
Prior to that, she was at the University of Kentucky.
Tout travail recherche chita sous langue créole mauricien. Juste un exemple sur un travail qui a bien pour paraître en longtemps, morphomic structure and Mauritian on change complexity and creolization.
All of her research work is based on the Mauritian Kreyòl language. Just one example of her forthcoming work is morphomic structure in Mauritian on change complexity and creolization.
Jodia li la ak nou pour parler nous sous Zile Moris.
Today she is with us to talk about Mauritius.
Merci professeur Fabiola, jouet pour vous.
Thanks, Professor Henri. The floor is yours.
Can she hear us? On mute.
Hi, I'm sorry. Ooh, hold on. I'm trying to unmute myself. Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Sorry about that. So, merci beaucoup. En fait, moi, tu peux causer en créole. Merci beaucoup pour ça, l'invitation, la Zach. M'honorer qui m'a gagné l'occasion aujourd'hui, l'occasion journée internationale créole, cause le Moris, le créole Moris, surtout l'aspect langage, l'aspect identité, un petit bit l'eau qu'il tient par sa quantité là. Et so I was saying that I'm very honored and pleased to be here today on this 8th edition of the International Creole Day to talk about Mauritius and its language, identity, and culture, a little bit on culture. So first and foremost, I want to say that, as Jacques mentioned, I am a formal linguist, so my work is mostly on trying to describe and formalize the Mauritian grammar. I work specifically on morphology, and so what I'm going to be talking about today is kind of far, although it is of peculiar interest for me because the evolution of language doesn't go without the context, so the situation, the dynamics that are present in the context where the language is used. So the paper has been prepared thus with the collaboration of a colleague of mine, Nicolas Nachu, who is a Fulbright Fellow at Kansas City, at Kansas University, and who also works at the Mauritius Institute of Education in Mauritius. It's an institution where the curriculum for the educational system in Mauritius is developed. All right, so I want to provide you with a short introduction on Mauritius. I realized when I came here that a lot of people have not heard about it, in particular when they are not very much involved in the Creole discussions. So I'm going to spend like a little bit of time to talk about its situation, and then I'll talk about what constitutes the Creole community in Mauritius, the Creole language, and a little bit on culture. All right, so Mauritius is a small island which is located off the southeast coast of Africa in the Indian Ocean. It's found here, you can't even see it. It's a little dot on that map. And compared to Haiti, for instance, it's very small and the population is a tiny fraction of what we see in Haiti. So interestingly, so it's in the Indian Ocean, but as we will see, it's part of the African nation, so it's part of the African continent, but the makeup, the ethnic, cultural, and linguistic makeup, as we're going to see, will be very different from what we see in Africa, right? The Mauritius, or the Republic today of Mauritius, also comprises of other islands, Rodrigues, Saint-Brandon, Agalega, and Tromelin and the Chagos are disputable because Mauritians are going to argue that those islands belong to the Republic of Mauritius, as it was actually part of the what was the government of Mauritius during the British rule. But Diego Garcia, for example, was kind of taken away right before independence for it to serve as a military base for the Americans. And so the populations of Diego Garcia were transplanted either to the Seychelles or to Mauritius. I should also say something about the languages that are spoken on those islands. They are Creoles that are varieties of Mauritian, and despite the differences that there are definitely mutually intelligible. Mauritius was an uninhabited island, and it was first discovered probably by the Arabs, who had mapped the island and called it Dina Arobi. And the Portuguese discovered it later and called it Sirne. They didn't settle there. And the first settlement really started with the Dutch, who actually didn't even want to settle there because they wanted more to exploit, what was Java at that time. And so Mauritius was that, landing port for them to then sail to Indonesia. So the Dutch stayed there not too long, and cyclones, hurricanes in the area did not sit well with the Dutch. So they decided that they would leave, leaving behind a few slaves and a few Dutch people. What is important here in the development of the country, the language and the culture has to do with the French rule between 1715 and 1810, followed by the British administration from 1810 to 1968. And the island became independent in 68 and a republic in 1992. It's estimated that the population is around almost 3 million. Right now, and it is described as a multi-ethnic society that is drawn from India, or at least South India, Africa, China, or part of China, and Europe, obviously, mostly from French origin. There is no official language, as it is the case here in America. What is mentioned is in the Constitution is that the official language of the National Assembly is English, but members can address the chair in French. Normally Creole is not allowed, but you do hear the politicians insult each other in Creole. The national language is de facto Mauritian Creole on the basis of use. So most of the population use it as their native language. It is really a few of them that do not identify Mauritian Creole as their native language. There are also some, what we call in Mauritius, some ancestral languages that are that have been imported, if you want, or that were brought with the indentured laborers after slavery, sorry. And those are Mandarin Chinese, Hindi, Marathi, Tamil, Telugu, Urdu, and I should note that in the school system, we'll talk about it, there is also Arabic that is taught. So what's interesting about Mauritius is that despite how far it is, there are so many similarities with a lot of different countries that have suffered colonization and are still suffering its everlasting impacts. It is true that here in America, when we talk about slavery, people are more familiar with the transatlantic slave trade, but it is clear that slavery under the Western expansion stretched way further than the West African coast, and was also found in the Indian Ocean. So a lot of people, of course, we know from history that there was a population movement within Africa itself, and in the Indian Ocean, in the islands of the Indian Ocean, enslaved people came also from East Africa, possibly from South Africa, Madagascar, and also Central Africa, we must say, because of the population displacements. The enslaved population, as we know, was disenfranchised from their native languages, right? The Code Noir during the French rule specified that they were not supposed to use their native languages, to practice their culture, and they were forced to assimilate, at least to a certain extent. And when I say that, it's, of course, we don't want to teach you the real European way. But so they were forced to assimilate into the colonial culture. And it is within this peculiar context that the Creole language is going to emerge, the Creole identity and culture is going to emerge. I want to point out that while most people see Creolization as a kind of homogeneous process, that is, people assume that it's the same across all the Creole worlds, the intricate development witnessed in Mauritius, and in fact in other Creole countries, argue for a more dynamic approach of Creolization, one which in fact naturally disentangle the kind of singularities that we see in the Creole words. So let me talk for one brief moment about the etymology of the word Creole, because it is true that very often we hear Jamaican Creole, or we hear, for example, Hawaiian Creole. But I want to say that the term is of Romance etymology, and hence the import of that word in English or in contexts where we have English-related languages that emerge is very often brought by academics, right, by the institutions. So the word itself emerged in the Romance kind of area, space. It appears to describe people who are of Spanish origin and who are born in the colonies. And in France, it appears first in a letter by Monsieur de Basse, who was the governor of the Caribbean at that time. And it says in 1670 that Kreyòl is a person of pure white race that is born in the colonies. Now, obviously that definition has evolved, it has changed given the different places in which it was used. Obviously it came later to be identified as a language, but when it comes to people, in some places, as in Guadeloupe or Haiti, people indeed who are born on the islands, not only the white people though, so there was an extension for any person born in the colonies to be identified as a Creole, right? And it is still the case in a lot of those places. So in Guadeloupe, everyone would identify himself. Actually, it's not even a question, right? So if you ask someone, are you a Creole? And they're gonna look at you in a weird way because it's not an issue. But it is, it is, as we will see in Mauritius when it comes to identity. In Louisiana and in Réunion, you can already see that, because in Louisiana, the Creoles indeed were the whites, right? And at some point, because of the political situation, the speakers of Louisiana Creole came to be identified as Creoles too, right? And in Réunion Island, it is, some people today will identify themselves as Creoles, but it was usually the case that the descendants of whites in Réunion that was identified as Creoles, the others, so for example, I would be seen as a calf or something like that, right? Which is more like aligned with the African kind of phenotype. So Mauritius is going to be very peculiar in this respect, since the term Creole is very unstable and ambiguous, and it has changed over time. As I mentioned, it extended from identifying people to the language that we'll come to talk about in a minute. So let me talk about that community. So compared to, say, people in the Seychelles or even Haiti, not every Mauritian considers him, her, or them as a Creole, because the term initially drifted, at least from a semantic perspective, to identify in Mauritius people of African descent. And so you would have those kinds of narratives in the description of Creole people with a particular kind of hair, which is very African-like hair, a particular kind of color, and some traits that are usually associated with people of African descent, like laziness and so on and so forth. But as simple as that might seem, it's difficult to actually identify who a Creole is in Mauritius, especially when we are trying to connect the definition of the Creole with a particular phenotype that would basically be equated with some African ideal that we have in our heads. So, for example, I myself have wrestled with this idea when I moved from Mauritius, where I was totally acknowledged as someone who is a Creole of African descent. But as soon as I got out of that space, I was no longer seen as such. And so even Black people would tell me that I'm not Black. So that is particular because, again, it is the context that is shaping a lot of the perception here. Given the introduction I presented earlier, you have already noticed that that the peopling of the initially deserted Mauritius resulted from the various waves of migration from Europe, Africa, South and East Asia, right? And it is really due to this successive waves of migration that the notion of ancestrality became a way of categorizing and acknowledging different ethnic communities that came to Mauritius, right? So it's important because compared, say, to Haiti or even Guadeloupe, where there were natives, Native Americans. So in Haiti, we can talk about the Taino. In Guadeloupe, we can talk about the Arawak, right? There was no internal route to which actually the people of Mauritius could be attached to. And so the various people would identify themselves according to where they came from. So the people who came from France would say that they are Franco-Maurician or French, and those from India would say that they are Hindu, Indian, and so on and so forth. It is basically with this type of categorization and acknowledgement of these different groups and linguistic practices and cultural heritage that this multi-ethnic or multicultural society that people claim Mauritius to be came to be. It is true that within those successive waves of migration, there has been a lot of contact. And today, most Mauritians, as I mentioned, speak Creole, and irrespective actually of the community to which with which you identify. So even those people who are from South Asian, who are of South Asian origin, they speak Mauritian Creole, which illustrate the fact that there was a lot of contact, right? Since the South Asians assimilated with the Creole. And of course, I am a typical example of the kind of contact, intercultural practice, and intermarriage that occurred in those times. But that kind of ethno-nationalistic discourse that would emphasize divisions gain ground ahead of independence. So when the British came and won over the country from the French, there was a treaty that was signed by both parties, which stipulated that the colony would retain what the French had built over the century. And that included language, administration, culture, and so on and so forth. And actually, a lot of the French stayed behind because they had built a legacy there. And so, because of that kind of double system, which is actually something that exists today, because people who, for example, have to study law, they have to study French law and British law, right? So because of this, so the French still remain in power. They had at least economic power, while the British had administrative power. And at the end of slavery, the British brought over in Mauritius many indentured laborers from South Asia. So much that the number of migrants from South Asia came to surpass the number of slaves that had been taken to Mauritius, right? And because of this power dynamic between the British and the French, there was a need to take control in a way or another. And since the slaves and the French had something in common, at least, right? Maybe the language was closer, and they kind of had evolved in a period prior to the British. And so the other ones were the newcomers, right? So in terms of creating hegemony in Mauritius, the British took on them to actually educate the South Asians who were coming. And so they provided schooling for the South Asian in English, but also used their native languages, all the languages that were, not all the languages, but some of the languages that were used by those populations. So Hindi, Tamil, Marathi, and so on. As we move towards independence, the British argued that it was a good thing to have that kind of division, nationalistic, ethno-nationalistic division, because it meant that every community would have a representation at the administration level, right? Or at the country level. And that the cultural and linguistic heritage would be maintained. But it also correlated with power and politics, which meant that if we educate the South Asian in English, then they're gonna be on our side, right? And so, and of course, on the other hand, the French were very resistant to the idea of teaching in English and teaching the other languages and so on and so forth, right? And so it is within this context that there is gonna be independence. And with independence, oh my God, I have this that has not appeared. With independence, okay. I'm sorry. This kind of division, ethno-nationalistic division, is going to be institutionalized so that in the first census, there was, people would record the number of people in this community and that community. And so interestingly, the type of categories that were imposed were very curious in the sense that they did not at all form a natural class. So there were Sino-Mauritians, which are identified on the basis of where they come from. So there is no distinction there. So it's a country. But then we are talking about Muslims and Hindus, right? And those do not identify a country of origin. It identifies different communities within India, right? In South Asia. And so the categorization is a mixed bag that identify people on their basis, for some, on the basis of their religion, and for others on the basis of localization. And that orange part that you're not seeing is this is like trash bag, which was called the general population, where everyone else who cannot identify with any of the other categories are put. And so this system of ethno-nationalistic divide actually erased the identities of a lot of people, not only the Black people, but also the mixed people, and even the white people, because there was no white category. And so the whites, along with the people of African descent, were put in the general population kind of box. And so institutionalized to the extent that the political system is actually based on, has actually integrated what we call a best loser system, where the loser in the elections is going to be composed of an opposition with a proportional representation of communities in the parliament, right? So it's still the case. Although I should note that the last census that actually counted those different people from those different categories was in 1972. So they don't do it anymore, but yet people still think of those categories as identifying ones. And of course, given the fact that there was that group which was put in that dump bag of general population, there was a lot of anxiety because, again, the same people were gonna be, in particular, those of African descent, were gonna be marginalized again, right? So with slavery came the loss of culture, the loss of roots, and so on. And now again, there was this kind of marginalizations where there was no way to identify any kind of origin. And it's true that it is the history of slavery that has kind of erased the origins of those people, because precisely we don't know for sure where most of the slaves came from. And so interestingly, the mixed people, because as I said, there was contact in Mauritius, the mixed people were also put in that trash bag, right? Because they could no longer identify with other labels. Or they were in some way rejected. And we see that in the expression perdi ban. So ban is the plural marker. It comes from the French word bande. And the people who are the perdi ban, they have lost their group in a way, right? These are the people who are the perdi ban. So I myself would be one of those people who are perdi ban, even though I've never identified myself as such, because since I was a kid, I I have always internalized the fact that I was a Creole, but it is only with research and asking that I realized that, well, my grandparents were Indian and they had Indian names, right? So we are Peadiban, and I do remember practicing some very Indian-like rituals when my grandmother was still alive when I was a kid. So Peadiban means that those people were kind of outcast in a way from their own communities. And so it's that general population basically who welcomed everybody else who didn't have any label. But of course, unlike white people who were also part of that category, who needn't justify their identities, because of course we know where French is from, and French is used in there is representation, overwhelming representation of the French culture and the French language, etc., in Mauritius. So they needn't justify their identities due to the privilege they've enjoyed, compared to the people of African heritage, who were always relegated to the existing category, which is Creole, one which has and is still seen as impure, mixed, and is constantly undervalued. Checking on time. And it is true, early documents, and even today, you will hear people say about Creoles, the community, that they are uneducated, they are lazy, which is something that comes from the colonial period, because after work, those people would sit under a tree and, rest. And so this was seen as laziness. The hair, as I said, coily hair, all of the traits that were very negative were associated with the Creoles. So you can see how there is a paradoxical kind of relationship for the people who are identified as Creoles in Mauritius, because on the one hand, they don't want to be identified as Creoles, because Creoles meant, you're not even a person at one point. And on the other hand, it is also true that they had nothing to basically attach themselves to, or to kind of look forward to. It is still difficult for some people, at least in Mauritius, to kind of embrace that Creole identity. And it took more than a century after abolition of slavery for Mauritius to have a Black consciousness, compared to, say, Haiti, right, where it emerged very early. It took a lot of time for the recognition that there was a marginalized community, and basically that was the Creole community. Today, as I said, more people are embracing their African origins. In the past 20 years, for example, there has been a little bit more representation, even though those representations are weird because, for example, Mauritian kind of inspires or at least kind of take from the South African culture, its inspiration or its ideas about being African, whereas one would argue maybe that Malagasy culture would be the closest in terms of who were really our ancestors. There have been, in the past 20 years, NGOs, cultural and linguistic centers like the Creole Speaking Union, the Nelson Mandela Center for African Culture, that have emerged to support actually that community and revitalize and provide more representation to the community. And I want to say that while Mauritians do identify with other categories, so for example, people, who would clearly be seen as Hindus, for example, there are a lot of people today who actually acknowledge their creolized practices. And when I say creolized practices, I'm thinking about practices that have come into contact and have either given rise to new ways of doing things or a kind of hybrid way of doing things. So hybridity does not exclude novel experiences, practices that can come, that can emerge in those situations. So clearly the evolving nature of the Mauritian sphere, or even other Creole sphere, require a more versatile way of talking about creolization and creoleness, because not only it is the type of theorizing about creolization would then take into account not only the kind of important ingredients in the making of Creoles, like the historical aspect, but also the different social makeup that are present and that actually contribute to the making of the different Creole identities. All right, so I'm gonna turn to the language, Mauritian Creole, which also obviously emerged during that French rule in the 18th century. The major lexifier is French, obviously, and the other contributing languages, as you can see, are different from, say, Haitian Creole or Guadeloupean Creole because of the heavy contribution of East African languages and Malagasy, and even South Asian languages like Bhojpuri. In the 2011 census, Mauritians have 84% of Mauritians have claimed Creole to be their mother tongue. So it's almost the whole population, right, speak the language as their native language. And then there are people who say that Bhojpuri are their native language, and others who mention French, and there might be other, like the other ancestral languages that we mentioned earlier, or maybe even English, that might be the native language of some people. When it comes to the contributing languages from East Africa, those are mainly Bantu languages, apart from Malagasy, which is a weird bird anyway. So it's languages like Makua, Makonde, Yao, Lomwe, possibly Zulu, and as I said, Bhojpuri from South Asia, from Asia, and English. It's the result of acquisition, of language acquisition, of the varieties of French. So it's not standard French that came to be spoken in the colonies. Obviously, this meant that the language that was on which the Creole was to be formed was not itself a standard French, right? And the speakers of those languages were themselves uneducated. So they did not have a standard French that would serve as the basis of the Creole. And of course, as is the case in a lot of Creole societies, because of its relation with French, Creole is seen as broken, right? It's not real French, it's fake French, it's broken French, or it's simple compared to the complexity of French, it's vulgar. This is a term that you hear very often and was used as an argument a few years back to say that we cannot put the language in the parliament because it's vulgar. Well, it's true that all the politicians were swearing in Mauritian Creole, but it does not mean that it is just a vulgar language and it has no other uses, right? As expected, because of its relation with French, it's very close to other French-related Creoles like Haitian or Guadeloupean in the Caribbean. And I have provided a few examples here. Jean pèmèt crabla, very, very similar to Haitian Creole, Jean ap mangé crabla. The only difference here is the shape of the progressive. So it has, in Mauritian and in Haitian, the same full form, it's apé, but the difference is that Mauritian drops the first vowel, while Haitian drops the last vowel. So apé becomes pe in Mauritian, and apé becomes ap in Haitian Creole. The determiner is postposed as in Haitian Creole, but in Haitian Creole, as we know, the article has a lot of allomorphy, which is subject to phonological boundaries here, right? Mauritian is like Guadeloupean. It does not have different forms for this determiner. And so it's gonna have la all the time. And so you can see with Guadeloupean Creole, it's also the same, Jean ka mangé crabla. The only difference is the shape of the marker here, which is more of a dynamic marker, which is ka for Guadeloupean. And then you may note that the shape of the verb is different. I said Jean pèmèt crabla, whereas for Haitian and Guadeloupean is manger, right? And so I'm not gonna talk a lot about the linguistics aspect. I just wanted to basically identify just a few things that would show how similar they are. They are very much similar in the vocabulary. It's the old French vocabulary, not old in the typological sense, that actually appears in Acadian French, in Cajun French, and in other French-related Creoles. So despite similarities, there are also differences that are the effect of the contact that you don't see in the Caribbean. So for example, there are two structures of the possessive construction. One is very much influenced by Indo-Aryan languages, so Bhojpuri and Hindi. So you have the possessive, la maison de ma mère, la case de ma maman, my mother's house. But you also have, mon maman sous la case, where you have two possessives that appear here, right? And then also you change the position of the possessor and the possessee. And so this is something that is an influence. The second one is an influence of the contact with Indo-Aryan languages. There are, as I actually pointed out earlier, something which is peculiar about the Creoles of the Indian Ocean. There is what we call verb alternations, right? You can see here the two forms of the verb. Not that there isn't verb alternations in the other French-based Creoles, but it's not as extensive as it is in Mauritian Creole. So in Mauritian Creole, the use of this alternating verb form has to do with morphosyntax, discourse, and also morphology. Here I just used two little examples, very easy. Moments d'Alpuri. D'Alpuri is one of those Indian breads also found in Trinidad and Jamaica. And so here you use the short form when you have an object, although not all kinds of object, not all syntactic kind of object is going to trigger that form. And you don't have any object here, you get a long form, moments and not moments, okay? And it's not the absence of the object that is actually triggering that form, because you may have an object but not following the verb that can also induce the long form. And then we have focus constructions that really are parallel. I'm not saying it's the same thing, and that's why I wouldn't talk about relaxification. That really looks like what is happening in a lot of the Bantu language, where there is a distinction between what they call a disjoint and a conjoint form. And that distinction is used in a very similar way as we do it in Mauritian. So you can, so those objects that follow the verb are not usually objects, but the form of the verb tells you that they have been integrated as objects because it's only objects that trigger the short form. And what's interesting here is the reason for that to happen is because you're focusing on the object, which is something that Bantu languages do. So object focus, here is the alternating, which is really interesting, with the same kind of following phrasal entity, right? So you have moments olame, I'm focusing on olame, but moments olame, I'm focusing on the verb. And here, what it means is that I don't play with my hands, I eat with my hands. So you're focusing on the verb. You have also another kind of focus, which is called verum focus, which looks very much like what you do in English when you use the verb do. I do love this, right? So then you're gonna have a long form precisely here, where what is expected is the short form, right? But you're gonna have a long form if and only if you are in a context of denial or surprisal, right? So for example, if someone says, I'm not gonna buy dapuri for you, otherwise I'm gonna be wasting it because you never eat it. And so someone can reply, maman dalpuri, to say, it's not true, I do eat this thing. And instead of using a do, as is the case in English, we use the different verb form to do that. So those focus relations are things that are phenomenon that can be seen in the Bantu languages. And so we can see the heavy contribution of African languages there. Ooh. Okay, so I do want to talk about quickly the fact that Kreyòl was introduced in the educational system, and it was introduced right after the government decided that the languages that are taught in Mauritius as ancestral languages in the schools should be weighed in. So Mauritian kids go through an exam, which is called the Certificate of Primary Education, and they are weighed, they are ranked on the basis of those results. And initially, the ancestral language that was taught in the schools were not weighed in, right? But there came a point when the government decided that this was going to be the case, and so the people who were the general population having no language or culture to identify, before the introduction of Kreyòl actually went to church. So we did catechism or something like that, or, you know, you would be sitting under a tree. That happened too. So there needed to be a gap. We needed to fill a gap, because obviously there wouldn't be any subject for those students to use. So initially the government said, well, you can go, which is very weird, you can go and sit in all the other Oriental class, which means that initially Creoles or other people unable to identify themselves with those languages were not allowed to go in those classes, right? And so at that point, the government said there's nothing else, so you can go do Mandarin Chinese or Hindi, until they introduced Mauritian Creole, which would then be introduced as an ancestral language, which would be used for Creoles to use as their ancestral language. Of course, there is a problem with that, because there is no equivalence between, say, Hindi, which is a language that was spoken where the South Asians came from, compared to Creole, which emerged in the country. Plus, everybody speaks the language. So it was problematic in this sense. And the government knew that the education system having English as the medium of instruction was a detriment to the instruction or the intellectual development of kids. So there were a lot of people who were arguing that Creole should be introduced in the education system for as a medium because of all the failures. And other people were like, we cannot identify with this language because it's not part of our heritage. And of course, there were a lot of those prejudices that were attached with Creoles. But I have to say though, despite the debates, clearly there has been really good results on teaching either Creole as an ancestral language or using Creole as a medium. So I have to say though, that the Catholic Church in Mauritius had indeed reckoned with the fact that there were failures, and with the help of local experts had developed what they call the Pre-Beck program, which is one that was designed to take in students that had failed in the Mauritian educational system. And the idea was precisely to use Creole as the medium of instruction for these students. But you can see that already the prejudice is still here, because it's only failures that we're gonna have Creole be used as a medium of instruction, right? So let me,
One minute.
Let me just kind of wrap up in saying that Creole was introduced in Mauritius in 2012 in the primary schools, and the Mauritius Institute of Education is working towards a curriculum for upper classes, and NGOs and other organizations and institutions are also working on the introduction of Creole in the parliament right now. And there are obviously a lot that have been done to put it in the schools, including writing the grammar, dictionaries, and everything else that is needed for its institutionalization. So last thing, culture. I just wanted to say that Creole culture should not only be confined to music and food. It's way more than that. It's values, how we actually live. It's values that are transmitted from generations to generations. It's crafting, for example, that parents are going to teach their kids. There are NGOs like Abin, who's going to be here in a few minutes to talk to us and present the kind of work they do to revitalize and transmit this kind of heritage. There are also the contes and the sirandan, where we are able to actually get the way of lives of people in the old days, and even not only the way of lives, but also even vocabularies that have disappeared today, or practices that have disappeared today from those contes. And it's true that in Guadeloupe and in maybe in Haitian, the transmission of oral oral histories is something that persists. So there are people who are still griots in Guadeloupe who tells, you know, those stories, for example, around Christmas, and we don't see that anymore in Mauritius, or at least I don't see it. So there is a need to promote and revitalize this heritage, whether it be in terms of the conte and the sirandan, or the arts, but also the language, among other things. I'm so sorry that I had to like kind of slide my way through the slides, but merci et bonne fête de tout. Thank you, and happy Kreyòl Day to everybody.
Merci, bonne fête.
Bien. Nous seulement gagné 8 minutes qui était Fabiola. On allait rapide.
Yes.
Groupe Abin.
Alors, est-ce qu'ils sont là?
Oui.
Oui. Vous parlez pour répondre aux autres questions. Si vous êtes, I'm happy to reply to questions if you have some.
Oui. Et on apprend question après parce que à 7 heures, nous devons finir.
Alors, je suis content de présenter Abin, qui est un groupe qui est là depuis 1982. Abin, ici, notre représentant, c'est Marousia avec Alain, qui, à la base, formation ce groupe-là et qui valorise les valeurs culturelles, que ce soit à niveau langage, que ce soit à niveau l'artisanat. Par exemple, j'étais dans une formation pour montrer zen comment faire ravan. J'étais dans l'école que je te montre les enfants anciens comptines. Okay, they show children the old songs that were sang in the old days. They also are there to transmit craft work, how to make musical instruments. And they just recently were named at the UNESCO for the invaluable work that they do. So I'm happy to introduce Marousia and Abin, and Alain, sorry.
Hello, can you hear us?
Yep.
Yeah.
Can you see us? Hello.
Yeah, you can talk.
OK, bonjour ou bonsoir, selon qui l'endroit vous êtes rester. Ah ben, il a plaisir, c'est une bonne célébration, journée mondiale langage créole et journée mondiale créole. Comment Fabiola Henri nous parmi les gens dans Moris qui travaille beaucoup avec ça élément la vie du monde, ça veut dire langage et qu'il tire qui autour et nous faire en sorte que tout ce qui du monde dans la population à la base peut vivre, je gagne l'occasion exprime-li et dans une forme qui à la fois permet de s'y vivre et développer, y compris à travers gagner beaucoup de plaisir là-dedans. Alors, à cause de ça même qui langage est central dans nos travail. Et pendant beaucoup d'années, depuis 1982, vini même, nous attentifs, nous bien attentifs à tout ce qui est exprimé dans notre langage, dans notre pratique, dans notre santé, dans notre danser. Nous bien attentifs et ça, il fait qui, quand nous recueillons quelque chose qui il fait, peut causer, peut dire, peut servir, nous restituons à la population pour rendre plus vivant, rendre musicalement, par exemple, plus intéressant et d'actualité, qui rejoignent un peu ce qui convention l'héritage immatériel de l'UNESCO demande nous faire. Alors, c'est comme ça que quand nous retournons les affaires dans la population, il reconnaît bien là-dedans et maintenant, comment dire, sa contribution-là est bien reconnue et acceptée. Et pas plus tard qu'ils ont dit même, ils performent dans un spectacle national à l'occasion 75e l'anniversaire des Nations Unies en présence de plus haute autorité pays Moris. Alors pour tout ça là, nous croyons que vraiment sa fonction qui langage et qui culture créole et là incontournable dans le développement du monde et il y a une grande utilité. Je vous dire des petits mots en anglais pour essayer de capturer un petit peu ce qu'ils m'ont dit, moi supposé.
Yes, I can try. So thank you for having us and bonne fête Mother Tongue Creole to everybody. So I'd like to go back a little from where we started in 1982, as Fabiola was explaining. The work of Abin started with differently abled persons then, and at that time we had to use the means that we have to empower people. So the tools that we had at this time was using music and language, even if it wasn't recognized back in 1982 as something that could be very helpful. But we used what we had, these tools, music, language, and culture, to help visually impaired and blind people, to empower them and to be able to be more independent. When we did that, we sort of got positive news from the public and the people who said that it was a very interesting job to use music and local music and the Sega and the Sega typique. And we saw also that the blind people were responding very well, that they were getting some sort of better. They were becoming like more assertive in society. And then at some point in the organization, we opened the door of the organization to children. It became very naturally because the association is based in a suburb in Mauritius of working class people, and an area which is also infested with drug. And when we opened the association's door to the people, to the children of this area, very naturally we used culture, that is proverbs, olden games, and the music. And also we started to play the ravan and to start a school for the hand drum, which is used in the Sega Tipik, which was also downlooked at that time. But we used all these things that were not valorized at that time, where it wasn't seen as interesting tools, but it was the tools that were available to us, and we used them, and we continued to get positive feedback. And we have arrived at a point now where we've got an accreditation at the UNESCO, and people are more and more connecting to what we are doing. And we can see now that the Sega Tipik is used everywhere, and the Sega Tipik is also inscribed on the list of the UNESCO. And what we've been doing all these years, it's now that we are seeing that it's getting recognition. People are using everywhere, are playing the jouer longtemps, the traditional games. And the Kreyòl language also is now no more associated with something vulgar, as Fabiola was saying. It's getting more and more recognition. People are using it more and more, even though it's got still a long way to go.
Thank you, Maruzia.
Ouais.
Would you like us to play something for you? So we'll try to do something.
Yes.
That's one of the oldest songs that had been collected during the colonial times by someone known as François Chrétien. And really it depicts in all instances the richness of the language and the music as well from the very start. So there has been that blending of tradition from all over the world. All those people that have come down here have indeed contributed to the making up of a unifying culture in which indeed all Mauritians now find themselves a place to live in and to breathe. This is what is all about when we talk about language and culture as one of the most unifying elements in the Mauritian culture. And we are known as a really peaceful nation. The process of nation building has to do with those unifying elements that are not that many, and that are constituted mainly over here by music and the Kreyòl language.
si c'est clair. N'a pas manqué, bon Dieu merci. N'a pas manqué, bon Dieu merci. N'a pas manqué, bon Dieu merci. Oh Lili, Tina Malgas, Molo, les mots, ça tu dois blanc. Regarde où les têtes, qui calpas, se me mettre la raque, les joues à des langues, la mauvaise la raque, les joues des langues, la mauvaise la raque, les joues des langues. Pe abolo mululu la buena bandu dambolambo buena bandu dambolambo buena bandu dambolambo Kambo desia pomo mena samti tanto vini soupe ope cuida poco si foye banane sous la sangrie banane sous la sangrie banane sous la sangrie la côte la petite tombe, les haricots poussés. Dans la case, papa, l'eau, pied, balsimode, bec, balsimode, bec, balsimode, bec. À mon aïe, solide, la case, au plus baissé pour me rentrer. Mon la tête, tout ça, sauf les cases. Olivier, tout ça, sauf dans c'est la moitié, solide, la case, mon plus baissé pour me rentrer. Mon la tête, tout ça se fait tasse. Olivier, tout ça se danse. C'est la Olivier, ça se danse. 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 Tout ça se danse.
So this is the ravan, the hand drum, which is made of goat skin. And we've been able to do a documentary film on it in the Kreyòl language. And so we've used in bilingual book, and where we used the savoir-faire, the traditional craftsmanship of people, of olden people who knew how to make a ravan from the bark of a tree. This one is from Rodrigues Island, and so this is what we call here in Mauritius the main instrument in the Sega typique. So it's closely associated with the Kreyòl language, because if we didn't have the Kreyòl language to get the savoir-faire, we would not have been able to build a ravan, the ravan. So it's a symbol of the resistance of the Kreyòl language, but also of the resistance of people in Mauritius.
Yeah.
So we can also talk about the what we call the categorization in Mauritius, with reference to what Professor Henri has said before. Our struggle as an NGO and an association closely, which is very close to people, we tend to see the struggle of the Kreyòl language more as a struggle from a class-based struggle, instead of a, of a race base here. I was thinking when I was listening to Professor Henri's talk, I was thinking of the struggle for the language, for the Kreyòl language back in the 80s, where the left-wing parties, political parties of Mauritius started to celebrate the Kreyòl Day, and it was just like tens of people who descended into the streets to celebrate, with NGOs like Abel, like us, and people were looking at us like as if we were mad people. What are we doing? Why are we struggling for this language? But now, like 30 years later, we can see now that it's being celebrated. It's gone a long way. It's being celebrated in the university. It's on the news. Everybody is like celebrating it in Mauritius. And what we can say is that it's really a unifying language here. And the approach is more towards it's the language of everybody. Yes.
So we got not much time left to us. We would like to thank you very much for having given us that opportunity to make a tiny contribution to this celebration. We really hope that this has been helpful to you, and we look forward indeed to be able to continue this type of collaboration, because it opens up our minds, it opens up much better perspective for the struggle in order to give better opportunity for people to develop through language and culture. Thank you very much for that.
Mabdi nou merci tout, Mabdi et professeur Fabiola, merci. Bon, nous avons une petite question tout court pour professeur Fabiola pour le répondre s'il a fait ça pour nous rapide dans 30 à 40 secondes.
Yes.
Et, OK, il y a un monde qui demande qui Jean fierté aille dans question langue créole là dans pays dans île Moris, dans pays Moris. Comment mon yo exprimer fierté ça?
Alors, c'est vrai que moi, je ne pas là-bas ça quantité de temps là, enfin pendant un bon moment. Donc, comment tu peux dire, là, sa relation qui bandi moun dans Maurice avec Kreyòl, il change beaucoup. The relation that people in Mauritius have with the Kreyòl language has changed over time, and I have not been there in the past 20 years. But I am definitely connected. I can say, for example, that I can see the difference between the kids today who have the opportunity to study Kreyòl at school. So, for example, I have a niece who was in primary school during that period where the government was experiencing between you can choose whatever other ancestral language until you get Kreyòl. So she did Mandarin Chinese, but she also did Kreyòl because she was in that kind of situation where she had both opportunities. And I can see with her, and it's interesting because it is true, as Marussia and Alain were saying earlier, that today it's more of a class struggle because, as I said, there is a paradoxical kind of relationship and it's still ongoing. So the people who were Creolophones earlier and who have been educated are now, because of this difference in social status, teaching their kids to speak French. And so that is something that in my own family I have experienced. So I never grew up speaking French with my mother or my siblings, but my mother today and my brother are speaking to their kids in French, which has to do with, you know, the social class status in social class. And so a lot of people who are these days being educated, they're kind of moving away from it in a sense, because they want to show that they are more educated. And so in a way, the Kreyòl is still kind of relegated as not the, you know, the most prestigious language, but yet you can see it from the perspective of kids learning it, they are very, very much excited to know the intricacies of how things work, despite the fact that they do it naturally, right? So it's very different as a linguist, for instance, using a language and knowing how it works is two different things. And so children are basically have the experience when sitting in that class to see how complex their language is, how beautiful it is in the expressions that we usually say can't be expressed in our language, right? So I think that it comes from there, and even writing. I know my niece would tell her sister, you don't know how to write Kreyòl, so just, you know. So there is some pride because yes, it is something that allows them not to distinguish themselves from other people in Mauritius, but to kind of embrace that peculiar kind of culture and identity that is specific to Mauritius.
Merci. Nous arrivons dans fin journée.
Merci.
We have reached the end of the day.
M'a dit tout le monde qui était présent avec nous sous Zoom pour aider nous célébrer journée ça et un gros merci.
I would like to thank everyone present with us on Zoom to help us celebrate this day.
Sans nous-mêmes, ça pas possible.
Without you all, this would not be possible.
Et un gros merci pour tout le monde dans Duke tout, étudiants, professeurs, staff, département et spécialement CLACS qui aident à réaliser 8e célébration.
A big thank you to everyone at Duke as well, students, faculty, staff, departments, especially CLACS, who helped make this 8th celebration possible.
Nous disons un gros merci encore.
Again, another large thank you to everyone at Duke.
Nous cassons rendez-vous pour l'année prochaine.
We will see you next year.
Merci Chloé, merci professeur Fabiola.
Thank you, Chloe. Thank you, Professor Fabiola.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Neil. Thank you, Isabel. Tant pis, mettez masque non.
Please
In
put on your
Mauritius,
masks.
we don't have to wear it that much.
En nous continue protéger yon l'autre.
Let's continue to protect each other.
Tant que parole la dit en créole, précaution pas capon.
As the saying goes in Kreyòl, caution does not mean cowardice.
Merci en pile.
Thank you a lot.
If you can.
Salam, salam.
Salam.
Salam zotou, salam ban moun.
Salam. Salam.
Merci zotin la, zotin le bonheur.
Nous péréal dormi.
Bye.
Salam. Bye bye.